Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie, and I am the International Affairs Officer for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. I welcome you to tonight's foreign policy panel, The Future of the U.S. Dollar as a Global Reserve Currency. The latest round of budget brinksmanship in Congress has led to increased questioning of the United States' continued prominence in the global economy. International discussions have raised questions of the saliency of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, particularly as U.S. budget matters only are delayed as opposed to resolved. What is the possibility that the U.S. dollar will no longer be the primary choice for reserve currencies? What would replace it? What, if any, impact would this have on the United States economy and our stature around the world? And does it really matter? Tonight we are joined by distinguished panelists and notable moderator to explore this topic further. Arvind Subramanian is the Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute on International Economics. He served in the Uruguay round of the trade negotiations at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, also known as the GATT. He contributes frequently to the Financial Times and is a columnist in India's leading financial daily, Business Standard. Joseph Gangon is a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute on International Economics. He has worked at the U.S. Federal Reserve Board on both monetary affairs and international finance divisions. He is the author of Flexible Exchange Rates for a Stable World Economy. Finally, moderating tonight's panel is Matthew Yglesias, who is the business and economic correspondent for Slate magazine. Mr. Yglesias also served as a staff writer for the American Prospect and is a former writer and editor of The Atlantic. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panel.
Thank you. I was telling my wife that I was going to moderate a panel on this subject, and she sent to me a tweet that a player, Martell Webster, on the Washington Wizards, had put out about a month ago, in which he said, "Government shutdown. I just hope we clean up this mess. I hope we don't lose the spot as the world's reserve currency. Hashtag can't afford that." And so I do think that it says something. I mean, maybe not about the issue itself, but about the timeliness of this subject, that it's becoming a concern that, I think you can see there has gotten out of the sort of narrow silos of people who specialize on this, and is an idea that is kind of in front of people's heads, that America has a status as the global reserve currency, that we might lose that status, and that we should be sort of deeply concerned or troubled about that. But at the same time, it's obviously not an issue that people understand very well. I'm not sure people even know what it means. Technically speaking, countries hold reserves. They hold various different kinds of currencies in their reserves. The U.S. dollar is the largest currency in that role. But when people talk the way Mr. Webster was talking there, I think they're not just talking about the official holding of currency reserves, but of the dollar's special role in international trade and commerce. Typically, anytime you have big global transactions, it's priced in dollars, trade is conducted in dollars. And there's a question of what sorts of benefits the United States gets from this. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously said there was an exorbitant privilege that the United States enjoyed from this sort of usage. At the same time, you hear members of Congress increasingly worrying about currency manipulation from foreign countries. And these are sort of two sides of the same coin. And so, I'm excited that we're going to be able to sort of understand this issue in a little bit more depth. And I believe Joe was slated to speak first.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Matt. So I'll talk a bit about what I see as sort of the trends and the factors that matter for reserve currency status, and then I'll talk about why would we care about reserve currency status, and finally what options are for the future. In terms of what drives reserve currency status, and maybe Arvind and I will have a debate on this. But it seems to me there's 5 factors: size of the economy, share in world trade, openness of financial markets, quality of institutions, and sort of inertia. Let me go through them one at a time. So I think probably the most important thing is the size of your economy. And I would say it needs to be measured in market prices. The actual currency that people buy and sell goods and services in the economy is the same currency that matters for reserve currency. So nominal GDP in the U.S. obviously being the largest economy now. But Europe, or the euro area, is a close second, close second. Now then there's a second thing is the share of world trade. So if you are important in world trade, then obviously there's a more greater chance that you'll have a reserve currency status just because of the convenience of using that currency in world trade. Third would be the depth and openness of your financial markets. You've got to have a lot of assets that people can buy without in a liquid way without changing the price. The U.S. clearly dominates here. And related to that, but somewhat different, is high quality of institutions. You need people have to trust your financial markets. They have to believe that their investments won't be confiscated, and they have to believe that probably there will not be an inflating away of the value of those assets. And that all that feeds into reinforcing the deep and open markets. Finally, there's sort of an inertia effect, which might be related to network effects. In other words, if you already have reserve status, and there's sort of a benefit to using the currency that everyone else uses, and so that sort of keeps you going for some time. It seems that studies show that changes in reserve currency are slow to happen. Okay, so those are the 5 factors. If we look ahead, if the United Kingdom and some other European Union countries join the euro area, so if we assume that all the European Union will be in the euro area eventually, then looking ahead, say, to 2030, it seems to me there'll be 3 contenders for reserve currency status: the dollar, the euro, and the Chinese renminbi. And let's just go through, one at a time, how these 3 contenders will happen. And by the way, I would assert, and here's where we can debate later, I would assert that I don't see much chance of the dollar being dethroned before 2030 unless the U.S. makes a catastrophic mistake. So I think the real issue is at around 2030, what will happen going forward? Could the dollar be dethroned? And in 2030, on my projections, which I think are close to yours, Arvind, these 3 regions will have roughly equal economies in 2030. So that's an equal outcome. Then it is true that China trades a lot more of its GDP than U.S. and Europe do. But I would think that share is going to go down over time, because if China is going to continue to grow, it's going to have to rebalance, and it's going to have to rebalance away from traded activities and more towards internal services. And so I don't know how much it will fall. Perhaps by 2030 it will be the biggest trader still, or it will retain some extra amount of trade. But it will definitely be less obvious than it is now. Now it trades about twice as much of its GDP as the U.S. does. So I think that will come in line. Then I think the EU, especially if these countries join the euro, probably is going to have to also develop a euro bond market, given all the problems they've had. So that would give it a financial market about the same size and depth as the U.S. What about China? Well, maybe, but it remains to be seen how they'll develop, how open it will be, how available to foreigners it will be. So that's a question mark, but it could be equal. Then institutions. Well, again, I think the U.S. and the European Union have institutions that are trusted and inflation that's equally low, and I think that's a sort of draw on that score for those 2. For China, this is the big question. Are foreigners really going to trust China with their money? Will they really feel secure? And it's certainly in China's power by 2030 to draw equal in that regard, but it will be up to China to demonstrate that. So it's possible, although not guaranteed, that all three of these regions will be roughly equal in all these dimensions in about 15 to 20 years. If that's the case, then inertia would still favor the dollar having a lead role, but the future would favor China, because China will clearly have more growth to do at that point than the US and Europe, and so in a forward-looking sense, it's China's game to lose. I would just end this section by saying I think externalities, network externalities, I think are somewhat overstated. And it seems to me what's quite possible is that all three currencies could have reasonably important roles to play in 2030. The dollar might have a slight lead, but that it wouldn't be all or nothing for anything. Okay, so, but let me say what I think is probably more important and maybe more controversial with you is that I actually don't see that there are benefits to being reserve currency worth having anymore. I think back in the days when capital was scarce and we could borrow more cheaply, there was some benefit. I think at the zero bound on interest rates, that's gone. Can't go below zero for interest rates, so there's no benefit there. It's actually a cost. And work I've done suggests that the cost right now is 2 to 3 million jobs that the U.S. is not able to get back, partly because of our inability to do a reasonable fiscal policy, and partly because the Federal Reserve is unwilling to do, unwilling or unable to do more monetary stimulus. We're sort of wallowing at the zero bound. There's been a sort of a little internet and Twitter sort of conversation lately about secular stagnation, which we can get into. But I see this as basically a war of capital. Nobody wants to borrow anymore. Everyone wants to save. And so the way to get growth is to send your money to some other country, pushing their currency up, your currency down, so you can get exports. You want to export, you want to grab exports, and the way you grab exports is sending capital somewhere else. So as the leading reserve currency, we are the biggest victim of this global war, and we are not firing back. And it's costing us 2 to 3 million jobs. So to me, we've gone from having a small benefit, the exorbitant privilege was never that exorbitant, but it was there. But now it's a huge cost. I mean, millions of jobs. So I think this has got to be kept in mind. Finally, let me just say, we're going forward. So one outcome could be that we gradually move to a tripolar world, as I described. But another option that I've been pushing, but not with any success, it's viewed as pretty far-fetched, is maybe we could construct an alternative reserve currency that would be really symmetric across everybody and not just the big three. I would like if the IMF would expand its definition of the special drawing right, the SDR, to include every country with open markets and sensible policies. So if you had, stable growth, low inflation, reasonable fiscal trajectory, you would be included in this currency definition. So it could include many small countries, including a lot of developing countries. And then the weights could be by nominal GDP or whatever you want, trade, something else. And then the IMF would just define it, and then it would construct bonds that are like an ETF, exchange traded fund, where they would just, or a mutual, sort of like a mutual fund, but I think more like an ETF, exchange traded fund. The IMF would go out and buy bonds in, say, medium-term bonds, 2 to 3 year bonds in every country in the new SDR basket, and put them together and sell shares in those sort of pooled assets to investors as the premier reserve currency. It's part of the IMF's Articles of Agreement that all IMF members, which is just about every country in the world, are supposed to make the SDR the premier reserve asset of the world. It's never happened. It should happen. It can happen. Why not? Why not make this symmetric for the whole world?
All right.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I have to say that, this whole currency transition, whether the dollar is going to be the reserve currency, is one of my favorite subjects on earth. And I'll tell you why. The history is fascinating. The future is fascinating. Just to give you one example, I don't know how many of you have read The Quiet American. And there's a great exchange between the cynical British journalist and this earnest American, right, who's come to Indochina, what is, the country, fictional country in Indochina. And the cynical journalist is telling, kind of ruefully saying, is confidence based on a rate of exchange? We used to talk of sterling quality. Now we have to talk about dollar love. Dollar love is based on good intentions, clear conscience, and to hell with everybody. So that was the tragic poignant moment when it was shifting from sterling to the dollar. And if you read Gary Steingart's book, Super Sad True Love Story, in fact, it's a dystopian fiction based in New York, where the only currency that matters is a Chinese yuan-backed dollars. If you have ordinary dollars, it's worthless. It's yuan-backed dollars, it's worth a lot. So it gives you a sense of how colorful currency transitions can be. So I want to make 3 points. One is, it does matter. Countries, for some reason, do want reserve status for their currency. And the flip side of it is that even if it's ambivalent, the costs and benefits, as Joe was saying, other countries certainly resent that someone else has a reserve currency. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So I think the reason why countries want their currency to be reserve currency is one that, Joe said that, if other people, investors want to pile into your currency, your country, the US basically can borrow much cheaper than other countries can, and the estimate is about 80 to 100 basis points, the US, and that's kind of a crude quantification of exorbitant privilege. But I think the benefits go beyond that. I think there's a serious convenience benefit that comes from having a dollar as your currency. If you go to Cambodia or if I were stuck in Zimbabwe or Myanmar, I would rather be stuck with dollars in my wallet than rupees or any other currency, because it's going to be accepted. So there's a huge convenience factor from having your currency. And the other convenience that comes is that Americans can basically think dollars, calculate in dollars, etc. Others, as an Indian, I have to say, oh, rupee, I got to convert it back to the dollar. So there's a kind of, that kind of inconvenience. So countries do seem to want it, and of course there are other political benefits that come from having a currency. In fact, the United Kingdom, one of the reasons it had this big crisis in 1956 is it did not want its currency to be devalued, because the Commonwealth countries, India, Australia, etc., were holding sterling assets, and the UK wanted to keep this Commonwealth together and didn't want its, and the basis for that partly was, sterling, and so didn't want to happen. Now, why do others resent it? John Connolly, the abrasive Treasury Secretary, famously said to the French, "The dollar is my currency, but your problem." And the French really resented that. And people forget that actually in the 70s, when the dollar was the standard, with high inflation and the US printing money left, right, and center to finance the Vietnam War, people said, my God, this is an awful standard to have. In fact, Pompidou said, we cannot keep forever as our basic monetary yardstick a national currency that constantly loses value. The rest of the world cannot be expected to regulate its life by a clock which is always slow. So we forget that there were times when the US was not a beacon and haven of stability, and there the dollar standard was a problem. And of course, in this crisis in 2008, I mean, the world resented the fact that the US was the origin of the problem, partly because it was printing money, credit was out of control, and the US, in a sense, created the crisis, in part because it could just print dollars, being the reserve currency. So I think so it does have value, and others resent it from having value. So I think that's the first point. So second point I would make is about the future. In my book, I've gone out on a limb and said that, in fact, the Chinese currency will overtake the dollar in about 15 to 20 years. Not just as a reserve currency, but as the premier reserve currency. So it's a very controversial statement, a very controversial position. And this relates to the point that Joe was making about the future. Now, there are three problems with my prediction. And instead of justifying my position, let me tell you what the criticism of my position is, and then try to take on those criticisms. One, I think people, and the point that Joe said, there tends to be kind of network externalities and persistence. So it's like language. I use it because you use it, and you use it because someone else uses it. And so, language tends to maintain its advantage. It's kind of persistence. And so people say that the same thing happened with sterling, that in fact the US economy overtook the UK in size around 1872, but dollar eclipsed sterling only after World War II. So they say it's like a 60, 70-year lag between a country becoming economically dominant and the currency becoming dominant. So that's the first critique of my book. The second critique is, in order to have a reserve currency, a country should be willing to supply assets so that the rest of the world can hold your money. A reserve currency is something that foreigners want to hold for some reason. That's what confers reserve currency. You don't get reserve currency because you say, I'm reserve currency. You get reserve status because the rest of the world wants to either hold your currency, denominate in your currency, pay within your currency. So that's what, so it's an attractive thing. And now the Chinese, they have a hell of a lot of controls. They don't allow foreigners, mostly, with some exceptions, they don't allow foreigners access to their own currency. So how can you have reserve currency, when you don't even have the bloody thing out for others to hold? So that's a problem. And I think the third problem with my argument is something that Joe touched upon, which is that, fundamentally, it is about trust. Will foreigners be willing to trust the Chinese government, in a very specific sense? Not just trust in the sense that will they, especially in bad times, behave, or will they expropriate the foreigner? I think that's the big question. And I think there's a kind of subtext here, which is that, can you really trust an autocracy? I mean, that's kind of, people don't say it explicitly, but can an autocracy, an authoritarian system, run a reserve currency? Will they ever inspire trust in that? So these are the three critiques of my position. And let me take each one of them on, and then we can have the conversation. I think the persistence argument is vastly exaggerated. And it's exaggerated for the following reason. Actually, if you do the calculation, something that Joe said as well, although the US economy overtook the UK economy around 1870, in trading terms, the UK was much bigger than the US until 1925, and trade matters for reserve currency. Similarly, the UK was very strong financially until World War I. And so it's not just the size of the economy, but the size of trade and how strong you are financially. And that flip over between the US and the UK, or UK to US, actually happened after World War I. It's only after World War I that the US definitively surpassed the UK in this overall economic terms. And then actually dollar started eclipsing sterling around the mid-1920s. If you look at, for example, in which currencies third countries issued bonds in. Until 1919, most of the bond issuance was in sterling. After 1919, flips. Most of it is in dollars. So in fact, the lag between a country becoming economically dominant and the currency becoming dominant is only about 10 to 15 years. And so what I say is that now, US and UK, if you measured all these things together, they're roughly the same. So apply that same 10 to 15-year logic, and you get sterling's, the renminbi, eclipsing the dollar. So that's addressing the first critique. The second critique is, will China make the changes that are required? Will it open up its capital account? Will it make its assets available to foreigners? Will it strengthen its financial system? All these things need to happen. And my response to that is that over the next 10 years, these things are likely to happen. For a number of reasons, the Chinese have begun to open up. The recently concluded plenum, they're again moving in a more market-oriented direction. And the important thing to remember is that China needs to make its assets available to foreigners, one, but it doesn't require a US-style turbocharged financial system. It just requires a reasonably well-regulated, reasonably transparent, a reasonably market-based system, and that's something that China can attain if it wants to over the next 10 to 15 years. Final criticism is really about this whole trust business. Can we trust the Chinese really, especially in bad times? And I think that's a very valid point. I think it continues to hold. But lo and behold, all these things are relative. Because my underlying assumption was that the questions were always about the Chinese, nothing about the US. But in the last 1 year, especially we've had these crazy shenanigans surrounding the debt limit and the possibility of the US defaulting. And if we were confident that this is one-off, then the spotlight will still be on the Chinese. But politics is polarized here. There's no guarantee that these things won't recur, because fundamentally is the problem. And then in that case, everything's up for grabs. Yes, China is not reliable, but is the US. What we've been told, in fact, is that if, for example, the US actually does default even for a day, a whole bunch of, gazillions of financial contracts will have to be reevaluated. Because, all these contracts automatically say, dollar, you can never default on this, therefore it's the kind of standard, but that changes. So everything changes. So going forward, therefore, it's up in the air. If the US behaves, its politics gets better, then of course my prediction will be wrong. But if these things continue and the Chinese start to reform in the ways that we expect, who knows? And that's why in 15 years, I would wager a reasonable amount of money that within the next 15 to 20 years, the renminbi will make significant inroads into dollar dominance, or whether I will be strictly right that it will overtake the dollar, is still up in the air.
All right. That's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But I,
Sorry.
but I think the most important question to sort of drill down into here is the question of desirability. So, Joe, Arvind was talking about the sort of convenience values of this, and it's true. I was in Siem Reap in Cambodia with my wife recently, and we just sort of took our dollars from the ATM here, and you can pay taxi driver, you can pay in a restaurant, dollar. You see tourists from Australia come by, and they've got to pay transaction fees. They've got to get either this kind of junky Cambodian money or get some dollars from somebody. So that's nice. But you're saying that there's a cost of millions of jobs, which is not so nice. Can you try to explain? So your notion is that essentially we are exporting currency to the world rather than exporting goods that could be employing people. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say that we're exporting financial assets. It's not literally. I mean, we are exporting some currency, literally, it's true, but mostly it's treasury bonds or other, U.S. instruments. I mean, it basically, the way the world works is if foreigners want to sell exports to us, and they do, and I think we should not try to, stop that. They have only two choices with the money they get. They can either buy our bonds, or or financial assets, or they can buy our exports. And reserve currency status combined with this desire to have positive net exports has led foreign countries to choose to buy the bonds. So I think that's bad. But it seems to me that the little vignette you gave about being in Cambodia with currency, I mean, I've traveled all over the world, and usually I only take about $100 of cash with me, and sometimes I never even touch it. I use my ATM card at the foreign country's, airport or wherever, and get their currency. I charge things on my MasterCard. If I was from Australia, it would be no different at all. I could still have a MasterCard. They have them in Australia, and I'd be billed in Australian dollars, and I could use my ATM card to get whatever currency was.
Joe, that only means you've not been to some of the more dicier places in the world, I think.
Right.
I was in India last year.
But also, I think to Joe's point, I mean, this is an issue maybe of of declining relevance. That it's
Yeah.
only the diciest places in the world
As I was
where
saying,
it's hard to get the basic payment infrastructure.
Just to compare it, I mean, well, even Cambodia is pretty dicey. I mean, you know,
That's a dice.
you know, you could if you're from Australia and suppose you're in a country that has no ATMs, fine, you can't use the card. Suppose you're in a country that doesn't take MasterCard, fine, yeah, maybe that's right. It is still very easy for an Australian to get US dollars in Australia. It's not a burden. Now, suppose, however, that you went someplace and no one had ever heard of the English language.
Right.
And you didn't know their language. Now, that might be a challenge. The fact that English is accepted around the world is many, many times more important to us than the fact that dollars are accepted around the world.
Right.
So the desirability, right?
Yeah, because this is what I wanted to ask you, because a lot of your, even just the positive prediction hinges on the idea that the Chinese government is gonna want this. But in practice, I mean, don't we see the Chinese constantly accumulating more and more dollar reserves themselves, precisely for the exporting reasons that Joe's talking about?
Correct. And let me say two things which would speak to the U.S. and the Chinese. I think even in the United States, I think there's a clear distinction. You talk to brilliant economists like Joe, and they will tell you that this is as much a liability for the U.S. because of the unemployment as it is an asset. And Joe thinks it's more of a liability. I think he underestimates the fact that when you had a crisis in 2008, everybody piled into dollars. Think of a country which has a crisis, doesn't have a reserve currency. You desperately want finance, and you don't have it. So that's a cost. I think that a benefit that I think, Joe, you underestimate.
How does that benefit us?
If
Can you walk me through this?
Yeah, if I were an emerging market country, right, and I have a sudden loss in confidence, like all these countries in East Asia. I mean, at that point, they would have loved to have had a reserve currency where the drop in confidence didn't lead to a plummeting currency, rising interest rates, and the threat of rising inflation. And so I think you slightly, I'm not saying that's decisive, but that's a real thing. But leave that aside for a moment.
Well, I'm going to come back to it. But go ahead.
For
a moment.
Yeah, for the moment. So even if Joe's right, there is a big foreign policy community in the U.S. that would insist that the dollar is a symbol of U.S. power. So there's a clear distinction between the brilliant economists like Joe and many others, and you see the same counterpart in China. So here's the interesting thing about China. China, Matt, you're absolutely right that at the moment they are behaving in a way that completely the opposite of wanting a reserve currency, because they're actually buying dollars left, right, and center to keep their currency down and gain this export. A cheap currency, you gain a lot of exports. But in the medium to long run, they also have a non-economist community, a foreign policy community, and for them, remember, you have to understand Chinese history, that they think of the period after 1800 to 1949, basically, that 100, they think of that as the century of humiliation. And it's a century of humiliation. Part of it comes from, of course, foreign domination, but also currency dominance. So their, politicos, strategic types also eventually want dollar dominance, and certainly they chafe under dollar dominance, so they want to get rid of it. So just as here you're seeing this struggle between the economists and the strategic types, similarly there as well. But I think historically, if you look at his arc of Chinese history, they want to become number one, and they see having a reserve currency as part of that package. And the final point, of course, is that remember that over time, over the next 10 years, Matt, their whole growth strategy has to change away from exports towards consumption. So that's going to be consistent with stopping to buy dollars, opening up their markets, allowing people to buy, and facing the fact that people will want their currency, but that means they will forego the export benefits from what they're doing now.
But now to the nub of it. In a crisis, or what we saw in 2008, people rush into dollars, they rush into U.S. government bonds as the safe asset. And is that really an advantage to the United States, or is that what's making it difficult for us to return to a full employment?
So I would say the latter. It's actually hasn't been an advantage to us. And I want to give a counterexample to Arvind's story, okay? Because I don't hear anyone talking about the massive sudden stop that hit Australia in 1998, okay? But the fact is, there was a sudden stop that hit Australia in 1998. They had debt inflows of 5% of GDP before the Asian crisis that collapsed and actually turned into a 1% outflow during the Asian crisis. And what happened to Australia? Well, they let their currency depreciate, and they got all their exports were able to redirect away from Asia. Basically what happened was, because Australia was not a reserve currency, you're right, they didn't have, they weren't a safe haven. People saw that they were hugely exposed to Asia. They exported mostly to Asia. They saw that their export partners were going in the tank, and people just wanted out of Australia. Caused the Australian dollar to fall 30%. And what happened? They redirected their exports to the rest of the world, and if you look at their economy, their GDP continued to grow at 4% every year throughout that, before, during, and after. And inflation ticked up by 1% for 2 years and came back down. So 2 percentage points higher prices at the end of all this. And that's all that happened to them.
But
And why is it different in Asia?
Can I give a counter example?
They don't borrow in foreign currency, and the other Asians did, and that was a stupid mistake, and that has nothing to do with reserve currency.
Okay, so let me give you 5 counter examples, but only one. Yeah. So in the summer of this year, 5 big emerging market countries, my own country, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, and Turkey, all faced what he calls sudden stops, i.e. foreigners who had lent money started taking it out again, right? Now, they all had their own currencies. Unlike in the past, they had very little foreign debt, but they all panicked, and they were desperately trying to attract dollars back. In fact, my brilliant co-author and friend runs the Indian Central Bank, and I can guarantee you, if in the middle of the crisis you went to him and said, Raghu, would you have had reserve currency status for the rupee to stem this outflow, he would have said, my God, I wish I had that. So Joe, I think you underestimate, because I think part of the problem is that the US is in the zero-bound world, huge unemployed resources, and all you care about is a currency depreciating. In the emerging market, well, things are different, and these are not just, small countries. These are big emerging market countries, and when they face crises, when capital suddenly flows out, I mean, there is real panic. There's political panic, there's economic panic, and there's social panic. And at that stage, they'd love to have a reserve currency.
Well, can I just say what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
The policymakers in these countries are either wrong or conveniently blaming somebody else for their problems. The reason these countries were hit is, to some extent, although less than before, I grant you, they still have foreign currency debts, which is just a big no-no in my book. When you borrow in a foreign currency and a shock hits you and your currency depreciates, the burden of your debt goes up. So what happens is that just when you can least afford to pay your debts increase. This is a recipe for disaster. Countries should avoid it. Australia avoided it without being a reserve currency. It has nothing to do with being a reserve currency. People lend to countries all the time in their own currency, and if they have good policies, they can expand that. So that's what countries should do. Each of the countries you mentioned had major flaws, and we'll stick with India. India has never conquered inflation and is on the cusp of rising inflation. That's a pretty good reason for investors to avoid India. And again, it has nothing to do with reserve currency status. It's a policy mistake the Indians made.
No, I think we can carry on this, but I think the point is that, having committed a policy mistake, you'd rather have a reserve currency than not have one, and so I think that's why.
Well, making mistakes is a good way not to be a reserve currency.
Can I actually try to redirect this briefly? Yeah. Your presentation is entirely about the U.S. dollar and China. But if I look at my list of sort of currency blocks, it's the euro that's coming in second place after the dollar, and that also, as Joe was saying, has some perhaps potential to grow through acquisitions. Norway, United Kingdom, Sweden, and so do you see any role being played there? I mean, especially if reserve currency status is so desirable, they have democratic institutions,
Right.
wealthy populations.
So I think 2 points, Matt. One, I think, is that, in some ways we've kind of caricatured or exaggerated this reserve currency because, throughout history and even today, we actually have a pseudo multi-currency world. In the sense that, in the late 1800s, sterling was very prominent, but there were also, the French franc and the Deutschmark also had, foreigners holding those currencies. Even throughout the 70s and 80s, we had, for example, the Deutschmark was partly reserve currency. So I think, and so going forward, what I see is that there will be Europe and kind of satellites where people will use the Deutschmark, the euro as a reserve currency. That's a Freudian. That's a Freudian
telling,
slip.
yeah.
That's a telling Freudian slip. And in Asia, I think there will be Chinese, Latin America dollars. But there are some currencies which will transcend that. I.e., you will have the dollar being used in Europe and Asia. You'll have the renminbi being used in Europe and Latin America. But that I don't foresee too much for the Eurozone. And the reason I say that is the following, is that two things. One, if you project all these numbers forward on size, I think even Europe as a whole, I think is not going to be as dynamic, as big as China and the United States. That's one. The second big question mark, of course, is that they may have good institutions, but do they have centralized ability to project power, project economic and political power? And that's a work in progress. There are people who think that certainly even as an economic entity, it's kind of they're both centripetal and centrifugal forces. Politically, they're far from being one. So if you don't have that central political and taxation authority to back a currency, it's not obvious that you can become a major international currency.
So now to pick up on something else Arvind was saying before, you're an economist, an economics guy, but there is a political element to this. The United States does a lot of things that are costly. We have all these aircraft carriers, tanks, nuclear missiles, and someone could say, well, you could all have fancier cars. What are you doing? And what we're doing, obviously, is we're trying to be a global great power. And so do you think, is this, the prices that you see us paying, is this sort of the cost of America's global role and really kind of a foreign policy question?
That's a tough question. I don't know how to think about that. I guess it seems to me that I think, assuming if we take for granted that we do want to have a global role, that we do want to be a superpower militarily and politically, then it seems to me that as long as we run our economy well and remain large in the world, we can do that, and it'll be very difficult for us not to be at least one of the main reserve currencies. It's almost impossible for me to see how the dollar could be dwarfed by the renminbi. And I think, although it's a debate and we're trying to be, interesting here, I think if you think hard about the different visions we've laid out, they're not that different. We both agree roughly where the three regions will be in 20 years, 15 to 20 years. I think the Chinese probably will succeed in becoming an equal-sized economy, and then I would say the shares of the currencies would be 40% dollar, 30% renminbi, 30% euro. You might think it's a little bit the other way, but that's not the end of the world. I just don't see how what could possibly make the dollar have less than a 20% share of reserve currency in 20 years under any scenario, unless the U.S. does something really
driven by the economic fundamentals.
yeah,
that
yeah.
America is so large
Yeah, we're
that
just
people
too
are gonna
large,
want.
and as long as we manage our economy reasonably well. Now, it is true the political, dynamic might cause ourselves to shoot ourselves in the foot, but it would take a pretty big wound.
But I think, Matt, it's a very good question that you pose. I think that, part of having faith in a currency is having faith in the government that backs the currency. I think that's a big bottom line. And that faith, can be inspired by hard power or hard power and or soft power, preferably both. And the US has been unique, like the UK before that, in having both. So certainly, the Seventh Fleet patrolling the South China Sea is part of, U.S. hard power, and therefore, I think, of course, Joe is right in the sense that, but if that hard power is coming at the expense of economic power, then I think you may want to reconsider that. But if there are no such conflicts, I think certainly a military, democratic institutions, the fact that this is the place that everyone wants to come to. So hard power and soft power underlie, a reserve currency. And China is acquiring hard power. And the point that I said about will we ever have faith in Chinese institutions and democracy is in a sense a question about whether China will ever acquire the soft power that's also necessary to kind of really shore up a reserve currency.
Well, because yes, on trust and China, it's not just, it is an autocratic form of government, but I feel like it goes a lot deeper than that. I mean, they have little pictures of Mao Zedong on all of their money. Their leaders come out of plenums, and there's a big sort of a banner of a hammer and sickle behind them. You hear all the time stories about farmers having their land expropriated as part of the sort of the everyday economic and political system of China, and they don't, geopolitically speaking, have a lot of friends in the world. They're in disputes with Japan, with Vietnam, with India. So where are these people who are going to say, well, I'm going to want to safeguard my company savings, my personal savings in Chinese government instruments?
So I think that's a very fair point. But so the way I think about it is the following: if you believe that, point one, I believe that China needs, the open trading system, investment as much or more than anyone else, because the whole development process is based on having this open system. One. Second, they want to be dominant in the world because they want to, pay back for the century of humiliation they've had. So if you take those two things, that they need an open system, they want to be the dominant economic power. Once they acquire that, why autocratic or democratic would they do things that would actually undermine the very basis of what they want to achieve? So in a sense, all the questions that you ask are fair ones, but you have to ask yourself that if the Chinese are really smart, which they are, they know that they've grown on the basis of all the things that they've done right. They want to be number one. Why would they muck about and undermine that? Mm-hmm. So that's if I were an investor, that's what I would hold on to buy Chinese assets.
So I think it's time to pivot to questions here.
Joe, you mentioned early on that you, I think I may have overinterpreted what you said, but you either implied or stated that the fact that our currency is a reserve currency leads us to sell our financial instruments. In other words, attain a capital account surplus, which indeed does result in a current account deficit. I assume that's where you suggest we're losing jobs as a result. But it would seem to me, and maybe this is a chicken or the egg question, that the fact that we have a capital account deficit, a rather surplus, may be more the result of the fact that we have very liquid bond markets in the U.S. that are by themselves very attractive to the world. And, of course, the United States remains a very productive, very innovative, risk-taking culture that implies potential for good returns on investment. So if you could address that, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Then, Arvind, I have one for you as well. You suggested that the China's moving away from export-driven growth to a more robust domestic consumer market would be coincident with China's ability to, or likelihood to, open up its currency for others to hold. I hope that's true, but I'm not sure if the two actions are necessarily linked. So if you could help us understand that, that'd be
Yeah, and
that'd be a plus.
these are related questions.
Questions,
Thank you.
Does the trade and the reserve status really link that tightly?
Yeah. So I think that first question's a good one, and it comes up in our internal debates at the Peterson Institute all the time. So the way I think about that is, first of all, there's two parts of the capital account. There's equity and there's debt. And I'm actually not going to have anything much to say about equity. I mean, it's hard to know what equity returns are or expected to be. And I see most equity investment around the world as just diversification. And so everyone wants to have some equity everywhere and vice versa. So the vast majority of the capital inflow to the U.S. right now is debt. It's bonds. Okay, so let's focus on that because that's where we can look at returns. So then the question is it foreigners just coming in because our bonds are so attractive, or is it that foreign governments are trying to push their currencies down and we're the reserve currency, so they buy us, right? Well, it seems to me that the way to distinguish those two hypotheses is mainly to look at interest rates. Now, of course, interest rates aren't everything, as you say. If our market is more liquid, people might want to hold our bonds even at a lower interest rate. That's true. But then you'd have to say, well, has that changed over time? What I know is that interest rates in the advanced world have come down as emerging markets, on balance, have gone from borrowing from us to lending to us. And so if you think about supply and demand and you see the quantity has increased, the quantity of capital flowing into the U.S. has increased, so quantity increases, and you've got supply and demand, and you want to know, well, was it demand that shifted out that sucked in the capital, or was it supply that pushed out that pushed in the capital? Which is it? Well, the answer is to look at the price. If the price goes up when capital flows into the U.S., that's because the U.S. is very attractive and is sucking in capital. That was a story in the 80s. Big budget deficits and tight monetary policy sucked in a lot of foreign capital. We had big trade deficit. But that's not the story since about 2000. It's been the opposite. It's been a big increase in foreign capital as interest rates fall. That argues to me strongly that it's supply. Foreign supply is pushing in on our capital markets and pushing yields down. And that is, assuming that the liquidity and attractiveness of the market otherwise is constant. But
on the Chinese side, the way the link works is the following. So you're getting all these current account surpluses. The dollars are coming in. They don't want to let the currency go up. So the central bank is buying the dollars, right? That's the first mechanism. But then, if they just bought these dollars, there'd be a hell of a lot of money supply in the economy, which would lead to inflation. So they don't want to do that. So they've been offsetting that by what we call sterilization. They issue paper. Now, in order to sustain that process, they need very low interest rates because if you're buying back the liquidity and issuing paper, you want the interest rate on that to be low. So the low interest rates that they have now is partly facilitating that. So now, supposing they stop both of these things, they stop the intervention, they allow the interest rates to go up, then what happens? They can no longer have the export-led strategy because the exchange goes up. And very importantly, as interest rates go up, the price of capital goes up in the Chinese economy, and so they do less investment and more consumption. So that's the way the kind of thing plays out in the Chinese economy.
I wonder, what do you foresee would be the implication of digital currencies becoming mediums of choice for people to transact money internationally, whether it is to save on remittances or whether it's to speed up the process of trading goods and other utilities?
So I see that here's where the different elements of reserve currency really start to separate, okay? And we haven't talked about that, but actually, I mean, it's implicit in what we said. But there are elements that have to do with what you carry in your wallet. There are elements that you can actually physically use. There are elements that have to do with how prices are quoted. And there are elements in terms of how do you save and store value? How do you, how do you, if you want to save for the future, how do you do that? And I think that this is, what you're talking about is all about maybe the first couple things, right? It's all about, well, do you need...
even the first thing, I think much more the first.
Yeah, do you need paper currency in your wallet? Maybe no more. And that can become irrelevant. Do you need... does it matter what currency you price? Well, you could price in any currency, and you'll have a calculator that will just convert it to any other currency. So you can automatically see you could see the price of this good in your currency easily and quickly. And it doesn't matter what the seller sells it in, you can see it in your own currency, so it won't matter. So these things sort of do away with the relevance of reserve currency, in my view. It makes reserve currency less important. But it doesn't change the final thing, which is if you want to save for the future, you're going to have to still choose some currency. And that's still going to be a choice factor. And it's still going to be the case that if countries want to push their costs down relative to their competitors, they're going to do it by buying assets in that currency. So I don't see how any electronic currency can change the ultimate problem that each country's prices internally are going to be in its own national currency, and that's subject to effects from, unless I'm missing something.
No, I agree with Joe. I think the Bitcoin is going to affect the medium of exchange role of the currency. But the store of value function and whether the Chinese asset is going to be as desirable as an American asset, that doesn't get changed fundamentally with the Bitcoin thing.
Yeah, as long as the government bonds are issued in their own currency, not Bitcoins, and as long as people's wages are set in their own currency, not Bitcoins, then Bitcoins just becomes a small thing and not.
But technology could enable some of the ideas you were talking about trying to revive special drawing rights, create some kind of constructed international currency, because traditionally for feasibility reasons, you've had to have these sort of round number ratios, a small number of currencies in the basket.
Yeah,
right,
we don't do that anymore.
Digitally, you could have a much more elaborate
That's
system.
true.
No, but Matt, I mean, on the SDR idea, remember, the problem with the SDR idea is that it's trying to create a reserve currency by fiat. The point is that countries become reserve currency because people want to hold it. I think it's the demand that determines whether it's a reserve currency. And so, so the Bitcoin thing, maybe some things it kind of improves at the margin, but fundamentally the desire to hold it as a store of value is more determined by demand rather than, what you do with it.
I guess you could imagine people borrowing and lending in Bitcoins.
Yeah, maybe. And I guess with that,
We are done for this evening. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their discussion.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.